Dave's back with us from the Detroit Free Press. Hi, Dave. Sorry about the confusion there, my friend. What makes this team and coaching staff believe so much in Marcus Davenport, do you think?
Yeah, look, he's a good player, and obviously injuries are the thing that have cost him and really cost him an opportunity. I mean, both with the Vikings a couple of years ago, the Lions last year, where he wasn't able to stay on the field. There is some familiarity with him, obviously. Dan Campbell and Davenport were together in New Orleans when Marcus first came into the league. The other thing I think is just the way they want to play defense up front. Marcus is a big, long, powerful man that sets a real strong edge against the run. Mm-hmm. He pairs well with Aiden Hutchinson, and when you talk about what the Lions want to do defensively, that's Dan's used the term "crush the can" before. That's really what Marcus is great at, and so if they can keep him healthy, they've got a pretty darn good 1-2 punch there at defensive end. It's just keeping him on the field.
Dave, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show. New look. New look. Let's stick with the defense. I want to ask you some questions about offense, obviously, but let's stick with the defense for a second. Dan Campbell came out today and said the reason why they didn't bring Zadarius Smith back is along the same lines that you said. They're confident. They're confident and comfortable with what they have at the right end position, and they feel that they're very confident in this defense. Talk about why they feel so confident in this defensive line, which whether it's us, whether it's them, there has been concerns about the defensive line for the past 4 years, but they don't have those issues right now.
Yeah, no, look, and they're a little more confident than I am, and I do like Davenport. And I think they have a really nice 1-2 pairing at defensive end, but depth, that's the big concern. And you go back to, even in the spring when Brett Holmes was, it was kind of like, why are you guys always asking me about defensive ends, and why does everyone want a pass rusher? And I think that's the big reason. It wasn't about Zadarius Smith, and it wasn't about Myles Garrett or Max Crosby or throw a big name out. Obviously, anyone would love to have those guys on the team, but I think it was more about just the lack of depth at that position. You look on their roster right now on the website, they have 3 players listed at the edge rush position. That's Hutchinson, Davenport, and El-Quadin Muhammad, and that's just not enough to get through a season. And look, they have reinforcements coming, and that's part of the reason why they feel comfortable, right? Aleem McNeil's going to be back, interior guy, but he's going to be back mid-season. Josh Paschal, he could be back in October as well. So, there's maybe a little more depth than it appears at first glance, but that's the big concern that I still have with this Lions defensive line.
Yeah, you and I share that same concern. Let's switch over to the offensive side of the ball. Okay, now, if I am a fan that is worried about, the offensive line, tell me why I should be confident in this offensive line that still features Penei Sewell as well as Taylor Decker and a bunch of young guys. Why should I feel confident in this offensive line for this season?
Well, I think the 2 young guys on the interior are both pretty good players, Tate Ratledge and Christian Mahogany. And you guys know this as well as anyone. Like, it's more than about just being good players, right? It's about continuity up front, and so that's maybe where some of the concerns come in. But I think from a talent standpoint, they do have a pretty good collection of that top 5. I mean, Sewell is an all-pro. Taylor Decker, we saw how much they missed him in training camp when he wasn't out there. Hutchinson was just destroying plays. He's a really good player. So you have, 2 sort of bookends there that are really good pass protectors. And then those 3 inside, they should be able to work well together now that Graham Glasgow, you've got a vet at center, now that he's handling all of those line calls. So I think the hope is that, as the season goes on, any hiccups, any sort of road bumps that they encounter here early in the season, those things will get smoothed out, and then the talent will ultimately win out. And again, it's a pretty talented top 5.
How much more command does Jared Goff have over this offense under John Morton compared to the offense he ran under Ben Johnson?
Well, that's going to be interesting to see too, because Jared and Ben were in lockstep. They had that sort of mind meld where Ben knew exactly what Jared wanted, and Jared could dial up, what the next play on Ben's call sheet was, and it remains to be seen if he has that with Johnny Morton. And that's a big thing in the NFL. I mean, to me, Ben Johnson was one of the elite play callers in the game. Right up there with Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan and Andy Reid. I would put him in that category for what he did the last couple of years. And, there's an art to that. And John said he's been a play caller in the NFL one time before with the New York Jets. It didn't work out so well. He told me when we talked this summer that it was, he needed this. He needed some of the training camps and practices and the dry runs in the game just to get back to calling plays and get a feel for it again. So, that's another thing that early in the season will be something to watch. But on the bright side, if you're a Lions fan, is, Jared and John have, they have a relationship going back a couple years when John was here in Detroit. And Jared said yesterday, John, just being a John Gruden disciple, sort of reminds him of Sean McVay in the way that they went about things in L.A. because of, Sean's ties to Gruden as well. So I do think there's a lot more familiarity than maybe people, give credit to.
I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of the draft pick when Brad Holmes made the decision to go after Isaac Tesla and move up wide receiver out of Arkansas. I looked at what he had done so far at Arkansas. I looked at the fact that they moved up for a guy that wasn't even a first or second option with the Arkansas Razorbacks. But obviously you watch him in camp. You see the things that he's able to do. You see his measurables. I'm not one who's easily swayed as it relates to the wide receiver position. But I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you, Dave, I saw enough to agree with, my co-host, Matt Shep, who said he'd be the starting 3 wide receiver when the season started. But I've seen enough to where I believe in that and I believe in him. Is my belief misplaced in Isaac Tesla?
Man, see, so you and I were on the same page. Like, I was questioning that, right? You give up 3 third-round picks.
Hell yeah.
Like a guy who was a part-time starter last year at Arkansas, and again, the measurables, everyone knows that. I have my concerns, and at the time, he looked like a number 4 receiver, and
yeah,
I still think he's a number 4 to start the year. Khalif Raymond had a really good camp. He was the guy that in all those 3 receiver sets, he was the number 3 receiver, so he's probably going to be your number 3 right off the bat. Tesla has definitely opened some eyes. He's a physical blocker. Obviously, he's a big body. He can go up and get it downfield. The one concern or question I guess I still have is, a lot of what he was doing was against cornerbacks who aren't going to be playing
on the
ball
roster.
Games. And so let's pump the brakes a little and let's see what happens when he starts playing some guys that, are your 1, 2, or 3 corner. And I don't think he's going to fall off and not catch anything. And, all of a sudden these issues are going to pop up. But the separation for him, even in camp, he never got a ton of separation at the line. And so maybe there are some small things that he's still going to have to work through in order to be a major contributor this year.
Well, why do you think there's so much national love for the Packers besides the Micah Parsons acquisition?
Shep, I'll tell you, I had to file my preseason predictions, Super Bowl, Lions schedule, all that, like early last week, so before the Parsons trade. And I had the Lions beating the Packers in the NFC. So I was kind of on board. Like I thought Green Bay just might take a step forward. And I think some of it, look, I think there's 2 things at play, right? Jordan Love, he got hurt in the first game last year. And so, if you kind of believe that, the Packers had the youngest roster, second youngest roster in the NFL too. If you believe that Love and some of those other guys are going to take a step forward this year, then maybe you do expect Green Bay to be a little bit better. They've got the 3rd place schedule in the NFC North. And then I think some of it is just, look, the NFC is still pretty wide open, right? The Lions, really good season last year, really good roster, but, people have asked, not just locally, but nationally, like, has their Super Bowl window closed? I don't believe that, but that was a talking point. The Eagles, I think, as good as they are, is, the questions are, well, can Saquon do it again? Can he stay healthy? Washington, they're sort of in the same boat the Lions were last year, where a team that lost in the NFC Championship game hasn't gone to the Super Bowl since like the mid-90s. So there's a lot of history going against them. So if you're looking for maybe a little bit of a dark horse, good team, but sleeper, I think the Packers are, even before the Parsons trade, I think they were on a lot of teams' radar as maybe this team can rise up and be better than what we saw last year.
Just looking at the NFC North, just sticking there, obviously, I thought the Packers were going to be the biggest challenge for the Detroit Lions, too, and that was also before Micah Parsons. I've stayed clear of that, and so now they have Parsons. I'm in lockstep with you. Talk about the other 2 teams in the division. J.J. McCarthy, who got the C on his chest in year 1 for him as a starting quarterback. He was named captain. Talk about what that looks like for them and what the Chicago experiment, because that's all it is at this point right now, is an experiment. We're still trying to see whether it's the coaching or whether it was the player.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing about Minnesota is that, like, I think a lot of people probably looked at some of what they did last year as being smoke and mirrors, and they've got a good roster too, and that defense and what Brian Flores has done really, really, really good. Kevin O'Connell's an excellent coach. But when you looked at Sam Darnold, you kind of scratched your head. I remember coming out of that first Lions-Vikings game. Lions won, but there was a play 3 minutes or so left. Sam Darnold had, I think it was Justin Jefferson, open on the sideline. He overthrows him. He completes that pass.
Yep.
The Vikings win that game. And so it's kind of like, man, maybe the Vikings overachieved. And you wonder what McCarthy's going to be in his first year as a pro. And he should be able to be Sam Darnold, because that's Sam Darnold we're talking about after all. But, Sam Darnold also had a career year. So the questions in Minnesota are primarily about, the quarterback, and, certainly if Justin Jefferson has some injuries, or, Aaron Jones has some injuries given his age, those add to the questions about the offense. In Chicago, look, I think they're going to take a step forward this year. I don't think they're quite playoff caliber, but again, I'm a believer in Ben Johnson, probably more than I am a believer in Caleb Williams, and I guess we'll see, how good Caleb turns out to be. But I do think, they've built that offense where they have some weapons that Ben's going to have fun and be creative using. And so I think Chicago's going to be a dangerous out this year. I'm not sure if they get to 500, but I think they're going to be a dangerous team, and I do think their roster has improved.
Can you calm the fears of some Lions fans who thought maybe the first stringers would play at least a couple of series in the preseason and really didn't, and probably because they had a couple of training camp battles with Miami and Houston, and the fact that they practice so hard, Dave, you're there every day. I know Avante Maddox recently said he was stunned how hard the Lions practiced during training camp, and he was with the world champion Eagles a year ago. So how much do you think that helps them?
Yeah, I mean, that's, Dan's belief, and you've seen it echoed by Ben Johnson now that he's the head coach, and Aaron Glenn now that he's the head coach. In fact, I saw some comments coming out of Chicago, this week from earlier in camp, where it was, some veterans said they had their hardest practice ever, and, they said, that they needed to be, Ben had told them they need to be calloused for the season, to kind of get them ready. And that's exactly Dan's philosophy, is that, you need to put your body through these things regularly, and maybe not quite as much as the season goes on, but especially early on to prepare for the gruel of the season, the grind of the season. And so, they look at the joint practices in a controlled environment where they're getting all their work in the situations they need to, and maybe there's no fear of Jared Goff or some of the other players, getting hit when then taking unnecessary hits as being all they need to get ready for the season. So, they probably still have some rust to shake off, like every team, but this has been the recipe they've followed for 5 years now, and I guess we'll see how it plays out this fall.
Dave, two quick ones. I think we can get you out of here, man. We appreciate your patience, and thank you for joining the show. I have two more. Maybe Shep has another one, but here we go. One, who are the top three teams in the NFL right now, in your opinion? And then two, this isn't about the Detroit Lions. It's more about Dan Campbell. Like, what do you need to see out of Dan Campbell this season? Like, what do you actually not need to see? What are you expecting to see out of head coach Dan Campbell, who finished runner-up for Coach of the Year last year in the NFL?
Yeah, I guess first question is, I'm kind of cycling through some of these teams in my head. Like, I think the Ravens have the best roster in the NFL, so I'll probably put them number one. They were my pick to win the Super Bowl this year. Beating the Lions is what I had. I don't know that I can go away from Kansas City at number two just because of Mahomes. I'm such a big fan, and I think it'd be tough to argue with Josh Allen and Buffalo at number three. I don't know that I want to go all AFC, but I mean, those are three really good teams. And to me, like the Lions and the Eagles are still the two best teams in the NFC. Just based on what Philadelphia did last year, I would put Philadelphia ahead of the Lions if I was doing a power ranking right now. Mm-hmm. But again, I picked the Lions to win the NFC, so I wouldn't argue with anyone who had them in the top three either. And then as for Dan Campbell, look, I think, everyone respects the job that Dan has done in terms of, building this roster, developing players along with his assistant coaches, getting them to play and to, show up in big time situations. The reality is, though, that, as this thing goes on and on and on, as the Lions get close and, things don't work out for whatever reason, maybe doubts start to creep in just in the general public. Like, well, can they do this again? Can they keep going with the same cast? Can they be motivated again, right? That's sometimes why changes happen is, when everyone is coming back and you kind of get content in your place, do you need a little kick in the butt? And so we'll see, I guess, a little bit if Dan Campbell, and I don't have any doubts about this, can get those guys motivated to perform. I think everyone does for him in that building. But, with essentially the same cast of characters coming back for a second straight year after they fell just short, I think this is the year that everyone's sort of looking for him and this team to get over the hump.
Dave, everybody recognized a year ago the strength of this team was its offensive line. What do you think it is this year?
Ooh, that's a good question, because I wouldn't put it as the offensive line. I mean, I still think it's the offensive skill talent, okay? Because I still think they should be able to outscore just about everyone given the personnel that they have. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery and, Amon-Ra, Jamison Williams, Sam Laporta, like those players right there are I mean, if you were putting together, they would all be starters on just about every other team in the NFL. Yeah, so, they can score on anyone. And now it's up to John Morton and Dan Campbell, for that matter, and that offensive line to make sure it happens and they still produce. I think that is the strength of the team. I think they're going to be better defensively, but defense it's a little trickier because one guy goes down, maybe that impacts the balance, or you lose one playmaker. I think they're good defensively, but I think their offensive skill talent is pretty elite when you compare it to other NFL teams.
We haven't talked a whole lot about Tyleik Williams. How have you been impressed with him, and how important will he play along his position, especially knowing that Aleem McNeil is out early on?
Yeah, I would say he had a quiet camp, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean like he didn't stand out for, getting pushed off the ball or being out of his gap or, doing things where he was getting cussed out by coaches. And, it happened, right? He wasn't perfect, but I think he was just a steady player that sort of blended in like, oh, that's a guy that you can rely on out there. And I don't know that he's going to be a big-time playmaker right off the bat. I think he's a pretty talented guy. I know he came in, maybe a little bit heavy, so they're making sure they watch his weight and they stay on top of that. But he's going to have a huge role until Aleem McNeil gets back, and probably even after, because then he'll be the number 3 defensive end, and we'll see what DJ Reader's looking like at that point of the season. Okay. So we talked about the defensive line earlier and the edge depth and not having enough and that being a concern. I think there's good depth on the interior of the line. You throw Roy Lopez in the mix, even Pat O'Connor. Mm-hmm. The Lions have a pretty good group on the interior defensive line.
Right, lastly, before we let you go, and we can talk to you all day, I'm sure you get this at every party that you're at and every family function that you're at. All they want to do is talk Lions, but that's what happens when you're really good at your job. So shame on you. I want to know. I want to know, Dave, if you think this team will make another move, if at all, before or early this season. And I'm not bringing up a certain name because I think it gets overpubbed, but there are some available guys out there you would think who could help them for 15 to 20 snaps, as Braylon has brought up before. Do you envision anything like that anytime in the near future?
I do, but let's just say trade deadline-ish time. I think the Lions are pretty comfortable with what they have right now, but you look ahead 2 months from now, like they're going to have injuries. It's inevitable. And so, if there are some on that defense, again, that edge rush position, like they're pretty short-handed there, even with Josh Paschal coming back at some point and Aleem McNeil coming back and, Malcolm Rodriguez coming back. Like if there was an opportunity to bolster that depth, remember what Brett Holmes said last year, right, where he was trying to trade for a defensive end and teams didn't want to get rid of their third or fourth guy just in case something happened. Well, this is a Lions team that is thinking long-term, right? They envision themselves playing for a Super Bowl. And maybe nothing happens by November 1st, whatever the trade deadline is, but you still got 2 months after that. So I do think the Lions at some point will look to add depth. And to me, that spot is most likely at the defensive end position. injuries could change that. Maybe it's somewhere else, but yeah, I'm with you that there are a couple intriguing edge players out there who, just on a situational basis, playing a role could help this ball.
Amen to that. Man, your time is valuable. We get it.
Yeah,
You
we
do
appreciate you,
podcasts.
DD.
You're doing stuff for the Free Press. You're doing stuff nationally. You're doing stuff locally. Everybody's tugging at you.
Kids
So
back
thanks
in
for
school
taking
now.
some time, man. We appreciate it. Hope the family's well. All the best, Dave. Keep up the great work, bud.